Hello, everybody. Everyone's sort of scattered towards the back, but thank you all for coming. It's good to see all of you here. This is, as most of you know, the Ann Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies Fall 2023 Lecture Series, and this is the Joseph Lebovic Lecture. I will begin with a land acknowledgement. Oh, I should just say, I'm Professor Andrea Most, standing in for microphone. Is the microphone not? Yeah. And I am standing in for Professor Nomi Seidman, who was called away suddenly on a family emergency. So I'm happy to be here and happy to be able to welcome Sue. So I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So this year's Lebovic lecture is given by Sue Kahn from Harvard University, and it's titled Canine Pioneer, and it promises to be really fascinating. I am very excited to hear about this fascinating woman and her work with dogs. So Susan M. Kahn is the Associate Director at the Julis Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli Law at Harvard Law School. She is published in Science Studies, Animal Studies, and Jewish Studies, and her book, Reproducing Jews, A Cultural Account of Assisted Conception in Israel, was published by Duke in 2000 and won a National Jewish Book Award, as well as the Eileen Basker Prize for Outstanding Research in Gender and Health from the American Anthropological Association. So it's my pleasure to welcome Sue.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope that this lecture provides some welcome distraction from the events that we're all, I know, very preoccupied with. And will give you a historical perspective that you maybe haven't heard about. You heard from the introduction, I'm an anthropologist by training. And when COVID hit, I decided to become a biographer and a historian. And so that's when I did the research for this book, which just came out from Brandeis University Press. And this talk is based on the book. I just want to give you a little overview of what how the book is structured. I made a decision when I was writing this. I was so overwhelmed with material that I also wanted to give voice to some of the very few people who had also heard of Rudolphina Menzel. So I decided to write the book as an edited compilation. I wrote the first half of the book, and then the second half of the book are 5 essays, very short essays, written primarily, all of them are Israeli except for one, by Israeli researchers or graduate students or other people who had come across Rudolphina Menzel in their work. And I was struck, since I was writing about a scientist, that I would try and shape the project the way scientists do, as a group project. And as it turned out, the Israelis needed a lot of editing anyway, so there we go. Okay. I also want to say one other thing. I wanted to thank Constance Chen, who is just an incredible organizer, and it's not easy to pull these things off, and she's been such a pleasure to be in touch with. And I'm so grateful to you for your very kind emails, and thank you to the Center for Jewish Studies here for inviting me and letting me come see Toronto. Okay, so I am going to, this is a biography. We all contain multitudes. I'm going to divide Rudolphina Menzel's life into 4 different time periods. Her life can be structured or is of interest to at least 4 different disciplines: Jewish studies, history of science, Zionist history, Jewish history, certainly animal studies, etc. And what I want to do is really focus, I could go in a million different directions here, and you'll see why in a moment, but I want to focus on the years from 1917 to 1948. So I'm going to zoom a little bit through the first part, zoom a little bit through the last part, and try and focus on those years from 1918 until 1938 to give you some sense of who this quite unusual woman was. Afterwards, happy to take questions on any particular topic, particularly if you want to know anything about my methods, sources, how I found this person. Did I just invent this story because some of it is pretty incredible? No, I didn't invent it. It all comes from some pretty amazing sources that very few people have seen or looked at. And that's part of the story, is not only telling this person's story, but then raising the question, why are those of us who are interested in Jewish or Zionist history never heard of this person? And even people who are interested in animal psychology and the history of canines and canine cognition haven't heard of this person. And so that's one of the questions that I want to open with, is why have we never heard of this person? I hope I convince you that she should not have been forgotten. Okay, so the star of our show is Rudolphina Menzel. She was born in 1891 in Vienna. This is one of my favorite pictures of her. She's circled there. She's a young girl in one of those bourgeois cosmopolitan Viennese families that many of us are familiar with. Even a cursory understanding of Jewish European history, you know about Vienna in the fin de siècle period. This was the world of Freud and Wittgenstein, and really wonderful time to be a rich person living in this extremely cultured world. Her father was a stockbroker. She was brought up in a very beautiful home, and she was always, as you can see, I think by her little expression there, a little bit of a she was quite an individual. This picture, I think you get a little more of that sense. She's a teenager in this picture, Rudolphina. At this point, she'd already distinguished herself not only as an extremely precocious and unusual student, she was also very truculent, very strident, very opinionated, very difficult, got into a lot of fights with people, arguments, but was really quite brilliant. And as a teenager was recognized, already began to develop all of her ideological commitments, which were extremely strong and sort of defined her whole life. She was a very committed social democrat. At this point, as a teenager, she was going to a socialist school, and she was identified as a potential leader of the Social Democratic Party in Austria because she was a great speaker. She was very charismatic, and she was, as I said, quite brilliant. She also, just by chance, and unlike anybody else in her family, she was a Zionist by her early teenage years. And for those of you who know anything about bourgeois cosmopolitan Jews in fin de siècle Vienna, generally not Zionists, right? Life was pretty good for them. Zionism was a pretty peripheral movement that didn't hold much appeal. But for Rudolphina, she happened to cross some Zionist literature. She read it. She became totally transfixed. It really transformed her life. And in fact, one of the great stories, one of the early stories of her individuality, or asserting her individuality, so that she skipped school one day when she was 14 to attend Herzl's funeral as it wound its way through the streets of Vienna, and without telling her parents, obviously. So what does this precocious young person do? She decides to go to the University of Vienna, and she enrolls in the same faculty that where Freud did his work about 20 years early, the Faculty of Natural Sciences, and she pursues a PhD in chemistry. While she's there, she did not abandon her political commitments, and this is one of my favorite pictures of her. You'll notice two things about this picture. One, Rudolphina is the only woman, and two, this is a meeting of the University of Vienna's Theodor Herzl College Club. This was the Zionist college club at the University of Vienna, which had no women in it until she argued her way in. And she convinced them that she had to be a member. And this turned out to be a very fortuitous moment, because it was in the Theodor Herzl College Club that she met her husband. who is in this picture. He's actually the one just to the right of Theodor Herzl, but you'll see him in a moment. So Rudolphina gets her PhD in chemistry at the University of Vienna. She meets Rudolf Menzel, who is like many middle-class Jews at the time, he's pursuing his medical studies. He becomes a doctor. And as soon as they both graduate, World War I breaks out. Rudolf joins the army as a medic, obviously for the Austro-Hungarian side. And Rudolphina is appointed the manager of the director of a large chemical factory outside of Vienna during the war. So they spend their wartime years apart. It turns out that Rudolf, I'm getting a little carried away because this part is so interesting, but I'm going to try and fly through it. Rudolf gets stationed at a small hospital, a garrison hospital in Linz, which home of the Linzer Tort. Linz is where Hitler spent much of his childhood. But at that point, it was a provincial Viennese town, and that's where Rudolf got stationed. And as the war ended, he decided to stay there. He became a lung specialist. He was beloved by many of his patients. By all accounts, he was really quite an astonishing man, actually a great compliment to Rudolphina, as we will see momentarily. So they decided to settle in Linz, which was an unusual decision because cultured cosmopolitan Jews after the war generally went back to Vienna. But they decided to settle in Linz. And of course, they immediately started a Zionist society. They became leaders of the very, very small Jewish community in Linz. They gave lectures on Zionism. They both became very active professionally. Rudolphina at that point became head of a socialist school in Linz. But it was a kind of a chrysalis time because Rudolf had his professional commitments and Rudolphina, and yes, their names in fact were Rudolf and Rudolphina. I didn't make that up. Her name was Rudolphina, his name was Rudolf. She was a bit at loose ends. And that's a very critical part of the story because it just so happened that in order to kind of keep her busy and keep her out of trouble, Rudolf got her a dog. And he got her, this is her first dog. He is a boxer dog. Those of you who know about dog breeds may think he looks more like a mastiff, but in this period, this is really what boxers looked like. They were massive, strong, working dogs. They were not cute little lap dogs. Very strong, massive, working dog. And Rudolphina named her first dog Mowgli after the character in Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book. And Mowgli really provided a gateway for Rudolphina into an entirely new career. She fell in love with Mowgli. She got fascinated with him. She had this kind of extraordinary mind where, you know, most people get a dog. I imagine many of you have a dog, you love your dog. You might learn how to train your dog a little bit. If you really like your dog, you might think I'm going to show my dog at dog shows. And that's maybe you'll even decide I'm going to breed my dog. And that's kind of the way that it ends. But not for Rudolphina. So she showed the dog, she loved her dog, she trained her dog, and then she decided to create a working laboratory and kennel, which she ran for the next 16 years, in which she studied, she designed an extraordinarily ambitious longitudinal research study in which she decided to study every aspect of canine development. And in fact, what she did, and I'll get back into this more in a moment, was transpose all the work that Freud and others had been doing in human psychology into the world of dog psychology. She became extremely interested in a field that I will name in a moment. I just want to show you this nice picture of her with the dog. And there you get a sense of the kind of the substantialness of the dog. She became at this point she reinvented herself from a chemist into a cynologist or a kynologist, if you know the Greek. And kynology was a field of study that was very big in interwar Europe. it was the scientific study of matters related to canines or domestic dogs. And so a kynologist is someone who becomes a master in this burgeoning literature. Konrad Lorenz, for example, was a kynologist. There were these other kind of gentleman scientists who became kynologists at this time. This was the field that Rudolphina just threw herself into. So she decided to design this, master an entire new field of scientific literature having to do with animal development and canine cognition. And she also decided to start using the kennel that she was weighing and measuring boxer puppies every single day of the first 12 months of their lives, recording it all. And she ended up over the course of those 16 years gathering data, an extraordinary amount of data on over 1,000 boxer puppies bred over 10 generations and 16 years. It was really an extraordinarily voluminous scientific study that she undertook, series of studies. She was interested in canine cognition, the origins of behavior, canine psychology, and she was also very interested in the question of temperament. Where does a dog's temperament come from? And I'll get into that more in just a moment. She also while she was doing this research, her laboratory, her dog laboratory was also a working kennel. And her working kennel became very quickly, as she became this sort of doyen of the kynological world in interwar Europe, became one of the leading breeders of boxers that were used by police departments and military departments all over Central Europe. So the Austrian police and army, the German police and army, the Swiss police and army were very interested in her dogs. Because she pioneered some ways of doing selective breeding in a way that chose for really outstanding character traits that made for great police dogs, that were pugnacious, that were protective, that were obedient, that were highly teachable, etc. So she, all dog breeders are lay eugenicists, right? That's what you do when you're dog breeding, is you're calculating which two dogs to breed together in order to produce particular traits. That's not a difficult thing to master, but trying to learn how to refine, expand, deepen, and perfect that process was something that she became extremely good at. And so it wasn't long before she was being invited all over Central Europe to give lectures on her field and how best to produce these dogs. And in fact, she was such a desired and regular guest at Kummersdorf in Berlin, which was the Weimar Republic's dog training facility, that she had her own special pavilion in which she stayed whenever she went to Berlin. And she took the train there, obviously, and was met at the train station, a big, sleek Mercedes-Benz, and then driven to the dog training facility and wined and dined. As she remarked, in what's the right word? Not nonchalantly, but as she remarked on this, she said, if Marie Curie was invited to Germany, she would be treated the same way. So why shouldn't I be treated this way? Was the kind of person that she was. There's a word for it, I just can't think of it. In any case, so she's training dogs that are a powerful form of military technology. And that's important to keep in mind, because there was this new understanding, a modern understanding after World War I, for all the roles that dogs played in World War I as mine detectors, patrol dogs, attack dogs, etc. There was a growing understanding that police dogs, that dogs could be sort of citizen soldiers, that they could be part of it was a new way of thinking about dogs as these sort of modern concepts of service dogs, which is something we all take for granted. But this was the time and place that those new notions about how to use dogs and sort of put them to use to better society was really being invented and pioneered. you know, I'll just take a little bit of a dog detour. You know, before that time, you know, there were shepherd dogs, there were guard dogs, there were sled dogs, there were sheep dogs, right? There were sort of these hunting dogs. There were these big categories of dogs that had been used primarily by people living in rural environments to, you know, to survive, that their livelihoods depended on dogs in these ways. But it really wasn't until World War I and after that people started to think, how can we use dogs in modern industrialized societies in order to perform certain tasks, primarily, you know, quite nefarious tasks, right? In terms of finding criminals, tracking criminals, I mean, you can call that nefarious or not, tracking criminals, guarding people, patrolling, etc. All the things that police dogs do. So we're now in the mid-20s. Rudolphina's famous all over Central Europe. She's running this, this is a picture of her and Rudolph in their home in Linz, actually, with two of their house boxers. She named all of her house boxers after operas. So she had Rigoletto and she had, you know, Aida, etc. And I like this picture because you see Rudolphina with her characteristic steely stare, Rudolph in the background. And those are Rudolph's parents, who I think, if you can see the picture, are looking at each other with, I think was a look that you can imagine was like, what the hell? Like, what is our son doing here? But anyway, by this point, so this is their house in Linz, which had become a meeting place for all kinds of interesting people. It was kind of a canine salon. So they not only had scientists and psychologists, they also had artists, they had you know, all kinds of interesting people coming to their house and meeting with them to talk about canine matters and animal psychology and the origins of dogs and evolution, etc. And Rudolphina describes this period as, you know, it was this great socialist meeting place where all of people's, you know, statuses that they had in the outside world just fell away and we could all just have these conversations. And here's a picture of them outside of their house with two of their, and you can see with three of their dogs, three of their big menacing looking boxers, and you can see the kennels behind them. So they're living in a little villa, and they're living in this provincial town of Linz, just on the outskirts of Linz, and they've got these kennels outside of the house that are filled with up to, you know, hundreds of barking boxers at any particular time. And there's a whole series of questions like, how did the neighbors even cope with this? This is a point to pause perhaps for a second and just to talk about the nature of their partnership. They were a childless couple. I don't know whether they decided not to have children or whether they couldn't have children. They did breed over 1,000 boxers together, I should say. And they worked in a very complementary way. Rudolphina had this kind of crazy mind and would think up all of these wild research questions, and she would do, like, you know, and generated all this data and tried to, you know, think of these incredible studies which were extremely creative. But because she had that kind of mind, somebody had to impose order on the results and kind of write it up in a more coherent way. And that's what Rudolph did. And Rudolph also was working as a doctor at this point and was supporting the entire operation. So he was a great champion of Rudolphina's. She would never have been able to do anything she did without him. But they were really partners. And in fact, everything that they published, and I'll show you in a minute a list of some of their publications, everything they published together as R&R Menzel. So here they are, these two, you know, Jewish intellectual elites living in this provincial town. And who are their new friends? But like a bunch of kind of rural, you know, landed gentry, landed petty bourgeois Austrian gentry. And you see Rudolphina there really stood out as a little, you know, very short Jewish woman in this crowd. And she was always very outspoken about her Jewishness because she knew that they all harbored latent or overt kind of anti-Semitic feelings. And she didn't want anybody to be in an awkward position where they would say something unknowingly anti-Semitic. She was like, I'm a Jew, I'm a Zionist, this is who I am. Very, very proud of it. But she certainly stood out in this crowd amongst all these other petty bourgeois Gentiles. So to give you some sense of these are just some of the dozens of publications that the Menzels put out about the canine sense of smell, different kinds of behavioral questions. They were all published in German primarily. You can see this, this was a bibliography that was compiled years later in Israel, because you can see the headings are in Hebrew. But and you can see the kind of journals that they're publishing in psychology and neurology. They were big contributors to Der Hund, which was the canine magazine that came out of Berlin. They're very big, popular contributors to Der Hund. You know, I just wanted to put some of these down here so that you know, Schweitzer Hundesport, for example. For those of you who have any interest in the history of science or the real history of their scientific contributions, there's an enormous work, I think, that still remains to be done. But I want to go back to her, well, I'm going to go back to this in just a moment. I want to show you one more thing. This is a picture from 1933. This was in the a local Linzer newspaper, and this is a picture of one of Rudolphina's dogs, and you see it says the pack leader Uther ben Satan. So this allows me to make the transition to talk about how she asserted her Jewishness. So her kennel, she named her kennel Bnei Satan, which in Hebrew means children of the devil, right? And that's what this says in German, right? These were supposed to be very powerful, ferocious dogs, and she was asserting her Zionism in this, you know, in this way. Another way that she asserted her Zionism is that she trained all of her dogs that she was selling to police departments and military units only to respond to commands in Hebrew. So she had to teach the policemen and the soldiers to say, you know, shev, artza, etc., which is like down, sit, you know, in Hebrew. And I think she did that just because she had a very good sense of humor, and she just thought it would be really funny. So she, you know, and there actually is a whole history in dog training. When you're training patrol dogs, attack dogs, police dogs, you train them in a language other than the language of the population that you're policing, because you don't want prisoners or people that they're guarding to be able to communicate with the dog. So it's just, it's an interesting wrinkle in this whole period, that's what her, that was one way that she expressed her Zionism. To make no mistake about it, these are the dogs that became the Nazi dogs, that became Nazi dogs. So the dogs that the Third Reich used were trained and bred according to the methods that Rudolphina Menzel developed and perfected. And I put this picture in there just because, you know, these are not, this is not a story of sweet pet dogs. This is a story, as I said, of really four-legged forms of military technology. Now, I'm going to tell a Palestine story in this, I'm going to go back to a Palestine story and go forward with a Middle Europe story. Because at the same time that Rudolphina is becoming a kynologist, developing these scientific studies, you know, breeding these police dogs, traveling all over Central Europe, she's not abandoned her Zionist commitments. In fact, from the early 1920s, she was writing to leaders of the Yishuv, of the Jewish settlement in Palestine, trying to convince them of all the ways that dogs could help Jewish settlement activities. This was really her, a great mission of her life, was training, teaching Jews to like dogs and training dogs to serve Jews. Now, any of you who know anything about Eastern European Jews, who were the majority of Jews who were living in Palestine at the time, know that they were not big dog lovers, right? These people were coming from the shtetls of Eastern Europe, where dogs were feared and avoided for all sorts of cultural reasons. So Rudolphina not only had a sea of logistical challenges in realizing her dream of creating an entire canine infrastructure in Palestine that could serve Jewish settlements by protecting them as guard dogs, as patrol dogs, as police dogs, et cetera, sort of transposing that idea of a modern canine citizen soldier into the realm of a colonial environment in Palestine. So she not only, get what I was saying. So she not only was doing that, she was doing something else too, which I forget what I was saying. But in any case, I think what I wanted to say was this whole notion of using dogs as part of a colonization process was very popular at the time. You know, the British were using dogs in South Africa. The Dutch were using dogs in their colonial activities. So this was something that, you know, dogs were, and certainly the British and India were using dogs. So dogs were proving their usefulness as part of as a colonizing, you know, or controlling activity. But I think what I wanted to say was about the Jews of Eastern Europe. She not only had this logistical challenge in terms of creating this whole canine infrastructure in a, you know, environment that was inhospitable, to say the least. An environment, I mean, a climate, inhospitable to say the least for pedigree European dog breeds. She also had to do it by confronting a sea of cultural opposition amongst Eastern European Jews who did not see dogs as useful or friendly or anything that could, you know, anything that they wanted to work with. And there was an additional cultural obstacle because those Eastern European Jews who were then leaders of the Yishuv, the Jewish settlements in Palestine at the time, had a lot of hostility towards or opposition to bourgeois Central European and Western European Jews who saw keeping pets as bourgeois affectations, right? Entirely out of line with their socialist mission of building a state. So first, you had to convince them these are not pets, these are working dogs, these can help contribute to settling the land. And then she had to think of, how am I going to do this, right? How do I, you know, think of all the things you need in order to sustain a dog breeding culture. You need dog food, you need kennels, you need harnesses, you need leashes, you need people who know how to breed dogs, whelp dogs, train dogs, clean dogs, deal with all the different kinds of canine diseases that existed in a place like Palestine at the time that had, you know, where there were malaria outbreaks all the time, there were rabies outbreaks all the time. So she was extremely ambitious in her plan to try and conquer really this environment and these cultural attitudes in order to create a canine infrastructure. So she's doing this throughout the 1920s, primarily writing letters, primarily trying to convince people, you know, to take dogs. She managed to get the Yishuv to send her a couple of kibbutzniks in 1927 who came up to Linz. She trained them how to train patrol dogs. She gave them a couple of dogs. They went back to Palestine and the dogs quickly died because it's too hot there. They didn't really know how to take care of the dogs and it kind of became a disaster. But anytime Zionist youth groups went to Palestine from Central Europe, you know, she would give them dogs. They'd go down there, Central European, whether it was German Shepherds, Boxers, or whatever, and they would inevitably either succumb to one of the many canine diseases that were rampant in Palestine, or they would just kind of, you know, get sick and die and not be taken care of very effectively. So it was a real challenge. I go into that in some depth in the book. But at that point, she still had never been to Palestine. She only went in 1934. The Jewish Agency arranged a huge trip for her. And she went to Palestine and she started training dog trainers how to train patrol dogs. She traveled all over the country. And she realized one of the first things that she had to do was write a dog training manual in Hebrew, which she worked on for many years and finally published in 1938. I'll talk about that more in a moment, if I remember. But she still, her focus and her center of gravity is still in Linz at this point. So she goes to Palestine in 1934. She meets with officials from the British Mandate. She meets with police officers in the British Mandate. She meets with veterinary authorities in the British mandate public health officials and talks to them about how to eradicate rabies, and begins to investigate, is there any way that we can figure out a way to bring dogs here and breed dogs, take care of dogs in this kind of an environment. And the Jewish Agency, while they kind of want to help her, this is a huge undertaking. They're not really convinced. There was not a lot of money to throw around something like this, to invest in something like this. So it was that trip was very frustrating to her. She goes back to Europe in she was only there for a couple of months. She goes back late in 1934. And, obviously what's happening in Europe at the time, the Nazis have taken power in 1933. And she immediately, she is invited to the World International Kynological Congress in 1935, which is taking place in Frankfurt, as the lead delegate from the Austrian. She's the lead delegate of the Austrian delegation to this Congress. 60,000 people went to this, and over 3,300 dogs were shown. It was not just a scientific congress, it was a huge dog show as well. Not surprisingly, Hitler's dog won first place. But it was meant to be a showcase of German greatness, just like the Olympics that were held in 1936, the following year. In fact, it was overseen by the same Minister of Sport in the Nazi regime. And Rudolphina gives really quite astonishing descriptions of, being a guest at this event. Rudolph was with her, of course. And as the lead delegate, she was invited to present her research or outcomes of her research. So this is a scene from the Congress, and this was the kind of event, where it was scientific Congress. So people are giving papers on the latest in ethological research on dogs. And Rudolphina takes this opportunity to get up and stand in front of all these Nazis and directly contradict their understanding of race. So, eugenics, pedigree dog breeders, they're all thinking, groups have genetic identities, they can be reproduced, there's a hierarchy of genetic identity, groups have fixed genetic identities, there's a hierarchy, and obviously this was central to the eugenics of the whole Nazi regime. And she as I say, very heretically claimed there's no such thing as race. Every individual is the product of their own mosaic of genetic traits. And to think anything else is incredibly scientifically misguided. Der Hund stopped publishing Rudolphina Menzel after that declaration. But I think it gives you some sense of the kind of person that she was in this context. And in fact, that point of view that scientific point of view turns out to have been exactly correct, right? That is now sort of an accepted common genetic wisdom that we are all products of, a diverse set of, each individual is a product of a diverse set and complex set of individual genetic traits, rather than us being defined as, in large and classifiable blocks. And unlike, I actually had the program to this Congress, and I'll just say this is the chart that Rudolphina showed. This is her. This is what she used to justify or to explain that finding. And it was by far the most complex, complicated, and in-depth data set that was presented by any of the other presenters. And I'm not going to go through this with you, but I think it gives you some idea of the way, and the scientists amongst you might be particularly interested, but of the kind of terms that she was thinking in, and of the volume of data that she was processing. So the mid-1930s, things are getting. She goes home after the Congress. She stops publishing in Der Hund. Things obviously are getting. I go into some depth why Rudolph and Rudolphina's lives and Lynn's were getting increasingly circumscribed, and they were encountering more and more overt anti-Semitism. Rudolph was imprisoned twice, in fact. and let go, but he was imprisoned just sort of as an intimidation tactic. But it really wasn't until in May 1938, when a municipal order comes through in the town of Linz that orders the Jewish kennel must be shut. So when the Jewish kennel must be shut, Rudolphina and Rudolf hurriedly pack up all their stuff. It was very risky and difficult to get out of Vienna at that time, but fortunately, they had an associate, a Hungarian associate from one of their friends in the world of kynology, who got them an exit visa to go through Hungary. So they really fled for their lives. I mean, they packed everything up, they shipped some stuff to Palestine, and then they took the train to Budapest. It was quite a harried, journey. They could have been found and picked up and imprisoned at any time. But Rudolphina wasn't going to not stop in the Hungarian countryside, where she knew this guy was breeding outstanding shepherd dogs, and she really wanted to learn what are the latest sheepdog herding techniques so that she could bring those with her to Palestine. Maybe I should make it clear, they were going to Palestine. They weren't going anywhere else. They had an exit visa to get out, and they were going to Palestine. So they arrive in 1938. Palestine is at that time, as many of you know, it was after the Arab riots in 1936. It was a very heterogeneous part of the declining British Empire. It was under British mandate. And Rudolphina at that point had some very good friends high up in the Jewish agency, and they gave her and Rudolf a house in Kiryat Motzkin, which is just right on the north side of Haifa Bay. And here's a picture of Rudolphina. She arrived really with very little, but she immediately put a sign. I don't know if you can see what that sign says. She immediately affixed a sign on the outside of her house that says the Palestine Research Institute for Canine Psychology and Training. So she immediately decided, I'm setting up my command and control here in this house. And she started collecting dogs in order to realize her vision of breeding dogs to help in Jewish settlement activities. So how much time do I have? I've got some more time. Okay, good. Because this period from 1938 to 1948 is kind of unbelievable. I'm just going to talk about this picture for a moment, and it gives you, I hope to give you a kind of a canine snapshot of what Palestine was like at the time. There are three different kinds of dogs that you see there. 1, 2, 3, right? And then she's got a little cat on her shoulder. She liked cats a lot too. The farthest dog on the right side of her is what she called a Canaan dog. This was a kind of stray, ownerless dog that exists all over the developing world. Any of you who've been in any part of the developing world have seen stray or ownerless dogs that just kind of run around, right? And they breed and they hang out and they are extremely well adapted to the particular climate that they're living in. But these are not generally thought of as particularly trainable dogs or particularly useful dogs from a European perspective. She called those dogs, they were known in the kynological literature at the time as pariah dogs. They're now known as village dogs is what they're called in the kynological literature. And just as an aside, I don't have time to go into it, she became one of the leading researchers on these kinds of dogs. In fact, published the first article about the evolution of these kinds of dogs that had ever been published, because she was in such a unique position in which to do research on them. And she writes, she really did in-depth ethnographic, caninographic research on this particular Palestinian variety of stray ownerless dog. She and Rudolf actually in 1960 published their great treatise on this kind of dog. It's called Pariah Hund. And it's a landmark in the field to this day. But she'd already started publishing about these dogs already by 1948. But those dogs are important because Rudolphina, as these are the kinds of dogs that Bedouin had traditionally used, that they tied up outside of their goat enclosures, their sheep enclosures, and they just acted as sort of canine alarm system to make sure that if there were jackals roaming around that were going to try and attack their goat herds, that these kind of dogs just started barking and alerting people that there were that there was a jackal or a predator in the area. So that's really all they were used for, was as these kind of canine alarm systems. But as I said, they were very adapted to the local environment. So Rudolphina had this plan that she was going to start selectively breeding these dogs by figuring out which of them had the sorts of temperaments that would be best suited to be real useful patrol dogs, guard dogs, etc. And this was an another kind of extraordinarily ambitious undertaking, because these are, they're not wild animals. They're domestic dogs that have become feral. They're sort of an in-between, but they are not particularly trainable. They don't like people messing with their puppies. They are, in general, don't have character traits that lend themselves to being great service dogs. But she, of course, knew that there would be some of them. Some individuals would possess those character traits. So she set about trying to capture and breed the ones that she thought held the most promise for producing the most trainable puppies. And in fact, the founding sire of her Canaan dog kennel, she later came to call them Canaan dogs, she named Dugma, which in Hebrew means example, and she bred him with a female dog she named Dugmona, which means female example. And they became the founding dogs of this Canaan dog breed experiment that she was she needed a climatically adapted local dog that she could, that would be able to survive in this environment. Because on the other side, you see her boxer, right? On the far side, her boxer was okay in her house. The boxers were okay if they were kept as domestic dogs, but it was just, it took a very long time. Ultimately now, obviously, there's a whole infrastructure for caring for pedigree dogs in Israel. But at that time, the boxers still were, they had to, it was really a touch and go, what do you call, sort of trial and error, trying to find dogs that could withstand the climate. And they had to invent all kinds of ways of keeping the dogs from getting, succumbing to flea diseases, parasites, and rabies, etc. So she bred a lot of boxers there, but very few of them. Took her a long time to figure out how to care for them in such a way that they would be able to thrive and be able to be trained. The dog in the middle, I'm just going to mention really briefly, that's a Saluki. And any of you who know anything about dogs, this is a form of greyhound that's native to this, that's indigenous to this area. It's basically, it's a kind of an Afghan hound. And then as when you get to Palestine, these dogs have a lighter color fur, less fur, because it allows them to function better. And these are dogs that have been traditionally bred by Bedouin and by Arabs across the Middle East for the sport, originally for hunting, but now really just for sport, for coursing. But that's a hunting hound. So that dog was bred as by Bedouins and Arabs across the region as a hunter and then for sport. So those are the three types. That's kind of the range of dogs that she is working with as she attempts to set up this institute. She's got local dogs. She's got the Salukis, which are great hunters, not great patrol dogs, not terribly trainable as police dogs. And then she's got pedigree European dogs. And I'll just add here, because of our audience, that there were two populations of people in Palestine at the time who were big dog lovers. Those were the wives of British Mandate officers, right, who came from Britain and liked dogs, and there were German Jews of the fifth Aliyah, the fifth wave of immigration to Palestine at the time, many of whom came with their little pet dogs. So Rudolphina recognized these two populations as being great resources for her in galvanizing their interest and enthusiasm for dogs. And in fact, she created the first thing she did was to create the Palestine Kennel Club, which had branches in all the major cities in Palestine at the time. And that was a way for her to encourage interest and enthusiasm in dogs. So World War II, here you have, well, before I get to World War II, here's one of the other things that she did was go around to all the different Jewish settlements, kibbutzim, moshavs, etc. And she started to train people how to use dogs to guard the perimeters of their settlements and to protect them from arson and other forms of sabotage that had been very prominent forms of resistance to Zionist settlement activities. So, I mean, it's just, the question of borders, obviously very crucial then and crucial today, but this was a form of canine technology to protect the perimeters of kibbutzim. And one of the main things she did was try and recruit trainers and dogs to guard the perimeters of settlements. That was one of her main goals. She also started doing veterinary research. As I said, she founded the Palestine Kennel Club. She started hosting, this is from the early, this is from 1942. During World War II, she's organizing dog shows all over Palestine. I'm going to show you some and quite an astonishing clip in just a second. And I just want to make a little bit of a detour because in World War II, obviously the British mandate officers knew they had one of the premier dog training experts from Europe in their midst. So they, through a whole series of elaborate negotiations, Rudolphina trained 400 mine-sniffing dogs to serve for the British Army all across North Africa, because of course the Germans had planted mines all across North Africa, and they didn't have enough mine detecting dogs. So Rudolphina was kind of galvanized into the British war effort to identify and train. This was one of her canine olfaction, or the canine sense of smell, was one of her great areas of expertise, and she had pioneered ways to get dogs to identify and locate mines and indicate that to their owners. So as one of her efforts it was a goodwill gesture to the British to train 400 dogs that then fought in World War II as canine soldiers. I should add here that, this relationship that I alluded to with the wives of British mandate officers is interesting because obviously it ingratiated her, and by extension, the Jewish dog-loving community with officers in the British mandate. So that's just a little wrinkle of this dynamic that is heretofore unknown, that this was a relationship certainly that the Arabs did not have, right? This was not an advantage. It conferred an advantage to the Jews at the time that the Arabs didn't have. And that became very crucial as in the War of Independence. Over 300 dogs fought in the War of Independence, or in the 1948 war, and these were overwhelmingly dogs that these were all dogs that Rudolphina had trained and developed. When I say overwhelmingly, by that point, by the late 1940s, she had sort of a cadre of expert dog handlers. And in fact, it turned out that they kind of turned against her once the state was established and demoted her. She was 58 at the time, as happens to many older women, I must say. But in any case, she was really sidelined after the state was established, but she was not idle. But I'll talk more about that in a moment. So I just wanted to show this clip to you, if I can figure out how to play it. This is I cribbed this. I kind of stole it from the Israel Film Archive. This is a dog show in 1938 Haifa. You can see Rudolph there in the Lederhosen. And so here's some German, these are German Jews with their pet dogs. That's like a little terrier there. But these dogs were being trained, you can see they're in, these dogs are being trained as patrol and guide, and these are boxers overwhelmingly, and they're being trained as service dogs. But any dog that had an aptitude, you can see that's kind of a mutt there, any dog that had any aptitude to be trained, Rudolphina, she traveled all over the country collecting dogs and giving them a canine temperament test to determine what their aptitude was and what kind of service they could perform. She's trying to impress people that dogs can do useful things, like jump over fences and climb ladders. These dog shows were not really served a PR function in that they made local Jews start to think dogs are interesting, dogs are nice, dogs are fun. She ran these, she brought Jewish children to come play with puppies in her home so that they would get enthusiastic about dogs. I almost done. What time is it? Okay, perfect. So that gives you some sense of that. Here's Rudolphina with these people are working with tracking dogs in Palestine. This is a proto unit in 1946 of the Jewish Defense Forces working with dogs, some of the people that she trained. And here are some pictures. These are pictures from the Haganah archives in Tel Aviv of dogs from the 1948 war and the kind of things that they were doing. As I mentioned, so these are dogs that, this is a clip following the 1948 war. Obviously, the Jews were victorious. This is a military parade. See if I can get it started. And I just want you to. The victory parade through the streets of Tel Aviv in 1949. Very short clip. But you see the dogs paraded as a form of technology. And the reason that I wanted to show that is because I don't know if you noticed this woman in the very front of that unit. This woman is named Esther Cohen. She's now in her late 80s, and she was one of my primary informants. I was in Israel, I was in Haifa about 6 months ago, and she's lucid and she still works as a canine consultant, but she was in this military unit. And she also was kind of Rudolphina's main disciple. There she is marching. Well, I just want to give a shout out to her because she's quite an extraordinary person. So here, you get a sense of these dogs working, the ways that they were valued. There then was a canine there was a canine unit established as part of the new Israel Defense Forces. But as I said, Rudolphina was sidelined. She wasn't idle. So they sidelined her. I'm going to run through this part. She decides, okay, fine. You don't want me to run the canine military dog training program anymore. I'm going to create a new institute, and it's going to be the first guide dog institute for blind people in the Middle East. This is a picture of Rudolphina in the front, and Helen Keller is in the middle. She somehow persuaded Helen Keller to come to Palestine and open up this Seeing Eye Dog School. And this was an institute that it ran for many years, then it kind of closed, and then it has reopened now in Israel. And Rudolphina was very intent. I think after the war, she thought a lot about all the ways that her dogs had been used to inflict harm on people, both in Europe and in Palestine. And she wanted to figure out a way to train dogs to be of service to people. And she was very adamant that both Jews and Arabs be accepted, blind Jews and Arabs be accepted as students at this school. One of her other projects was she formally established a dog breed named the Israel Canine Dog. This is a registered breed in the American Kennel Club. It's recognized. If you watch Crufts or Westminster, you'll see the Canine dog compete. It never wins anything. And it's a dog that has become very popular in this country amongst very small groups of people. evangelical Christians who want a dog that walked with Jesus, natural dog enthusiasts who want a dog that has been, untouched from ancient times and that potentially is the missing link between wolves and dogs, total myth. And also by Jews who are Zionists and want a Zionist dog. Israelis are not crazy about this dog because they see this dog just like running around as a stray dog, and they're not impressed. Israelis have, though, become very devoted breeders of service dogs, and in fact have pioneered all kinds of methods when it comes to service dog training.